a wretched millionaire CEO stuck in traffic then. A single mom on a beat, heen is in nay. Mamataus changed his day. Jonathan Pierce had everything a fortune, a mansion, a name that opened doors. But on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, stuck in traffic and late for the biggest deal of his career, he was about to learn that wealth means nothing when you've forgotten what it means to be human. A woman on a rusted bicycle, drenched and determined, would cross his path in mere seconds. She had no idea she was about to save him. He had no idea he was about to be changed forever. This is the story of a single mother who had lost everything except the one thing money can't buy. Jonathan Pierce checked his Rolex for the fourth time in 3 minutes. The diamond-studded hands mocked him 7:47 a.m. His meeting was at 8 o'clock sharp, and he was still 12 blocks away, trapped in a sea of honking cars and flashing brake lights. Rain hammered against the roof of his Mercedes like an angry drum, and the wipers worked frantically to clear the windshield. "This is unacceptable," he muttered, jabbing at his phone. His assistant answered on the first ring. "Mr. Pierce, they're asking if you need to reschedule." "No," he snapped. "Tell them I'll be there. Traffic won't hold me up forever." But traffic didn't care about Jonathan Pierce or his $12 million deal. The gridlock stretched endlessly ahead, a river of metal and frustration. He loosened his tie, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest, the same pressure that had been building for months, maybe years. At 42 years old, Jonathan had built an empire. Pierce Holdings owned hotels, restaurants, commercial real estate across 3 states. His face had been on the cover of Forbes twice. People spoke his name with respect, sometimes fear. He'd worked every day for 20 years to get here, sacrificing friendships, relationships, sleep, peace, all for success. And yet, sitting in that leather seat watching the rain blur the world outside, he felt nothing but emptiness. The car inched forward. Jonathan looked out the window and saw her. She was on a bicycle, an old rusted thing with a wobbly front wheel. The rain soaked through her thin jacket, plastering her dark hair against her face. But what caught his attention wasn't the woman herself. It was the child. A little boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sat in a makeshift seat attached to the back of the bike. Someone had rigged a plastic tarp over him, trying to shield him from the rain, but it was clearly failing. The boy's small hands gripped the sides of the seat, his face turned upward toward his mother with complete trust. The woman pedaled steadily through the downpour, weaving carefully between the stopped cars. Her legs moved with determination, though Jonathan could see she was struggling. Her shoes were worn through, her clothes soaked, but she didn't stop. She kept pedaling. Jonathan watched them pass, and something shifted inside him, something uncomfortable, like a stone turning over in still water. His driver glanced in the rearview mirror. Tough way to travel in this weather. Jonathan said nothing. He was still watching the woman and the boy disappear into the rain, becoming smaller and smaller until they were just shadows in the storm. The traffic began to move. Jonathan made it to his meeting 17 minutes late. The deal fell through anyway. The investors had already decided to go with someone else, someone younger, hungrier, more in touch with the community, they said. Jonathan sat in the empty conference room after everyone had left, staring at the rain-streaked windows. For the first time in 20 years, he wondered if he'd been chasing the wrong thing all along. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing that woman on the bicycle, that little boy under the torn plastic tarp, those steady legs pedaling through the storm. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But something told him he needed to find out. Her name was Grace Moreno, and she had been awake since 4:30 in the morning. The alarm hadn't gone off, it never did anymore. The battery long dead, but Grace's body had learned to wake itself. She rose in the dark, careful not to disturb her son Mateo, who slept curled up on the pull-out couch they shared. Their apartment was small, just one room with a tiny kitchen and a bathroom where the toilet sometimes refused to flush. But it was theirs. For now, Grace moved quietly through the morning routine she perfected over 3 years of single motherhood. She made oatmeal on the hot plate. The stove had stopped working months ago, and packed Mateo's lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple she'd gotten from the discount bin, and a juice box she'd saved from her own lunch the day before. She worked 2 jobs. In the mornings, she cleaned offices downtown, starting at 5:30 and finishing at 9. In the afternoons, she worked at a laundromat, folding other people's clothes until 6 in the evening. Between jobs, she had exactly 47 minutes to pick up Mateo from the neighbor who watched him before school, drop him at the elementary school 8 blocks away, and get across town to the laundromat. She made this journey on her bicycle because she couldn't afford bus fare for 2 people every day. The bike had been a gift from a church donation drive. Already old when she got it, she'd attached the child seat herself, using instructions from a library computer and parts from a second-hand store. It wasn't much, but it worked. Mateo woke at 6:15, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, good morning, mi amor." Grace kissed his forehead. "Time to get ready." He was a beautiful child, her miracle, she called him. His dark eyes were curious and kind, his smile quick despite everything they'd been through. He never complained about the early mornings, the small apartment, the same peanut butter sandwiches day after day. "Is it raining?" he asked, looking toward the window. "A little," Grace lied. She'd already checked it was pouring. They ate breakfast together at the small table Grace had found on the curb and prepared herself. Mateo told her about a book his teacher had read to the class, about a bear who went on an adventure. His face lit up when he talked about stories, about learning, about school. Grace's heart ached with love and worry. Mateo was smart, so smart. His teacher had told Grace that he was reading at a 4th grade level, that he asked questions that showed exceptional critical thinking. But what future could Grace give him in this tiny apartment, with these 2 jobs that barely kept them fed? She pushed the thought away. She'd made a promise to herself and to God. She would give Mateo everything she could. She would show him that dignity wasn't about money or comfort, it was about character, about doing your best with what you had, about treating people with kindness, no matter what. At 7:15, they left the apartment. Grace locked the door, though there was little inside worth stealing, and helped Mateo onto the bike seat. She'd sewn a small cushion to make it more comfortable, and she'd rigged the plastic tarp to keep him as dry as possible. "Hold on tight, mi amor." "I always do, Mama." The rain came down harder as they rode. Grace felt it soaking through her jacket, felt her shoes squelching with water, but she kept pedaling. Her legs burned, they always did, but she didn't stop. Mateo was depending on her. They passed through the wealthy part of town, where Grace cleaned offices in the mornings. The streets here were lined with expensive cars, luxury shops, restaurants where a single meal cost more than Grace made in a week. She didn't feel bitter about it. She felt curious. Sometimes sad, but never bitter. Everyone had their own struggles, she believed. Money didn't protect you from loneliness or fear or pain. It just hid it better. As they pedaled through the gridlocked traffic, Grace noticed a sleek black Mercedes stuck in the jam. Through the rain-blurred window, she caught a glimpse of a man inside, a businessman, probably, in his expensive suit, checking his expensive watch. She wondered if he was happy. Then she pedaled on, because she had 47 minutes to make her schedule work, and wondering about strangers wouldn't help. Jonathan Pierce couldn't explain it, even to himself. For 3 days after losing the deal, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman on the bicycle. He'd built a career on focus, on strategic thinking, on keeping emotions separate from business. But this wasn't business. This was something else entirely. He started driving the same route every morning, leaving his house earlier than necessary, taking the long way to his office. He told himself it was ridiculous. He was a busy man with responsibilities, not some amateur detective chasing ghosts in the rain. But on the 4th morning, he saw her again. Same bicycle, same child, same determined pedaling through the early morning streets. This time there was no rain, just the pale gold light of dawn. Jonathan watched as she stopped at an elementary school, helped the boy down from the bike seat, straightened his backpack, and kissed his forehead. The tenderness of that gesture struck Jonathan like a physical blow. He had his driver pull over a block away and watched as the woman Grace, he would later learn, pedaled away toward the industrial district. Jonathan checked his watch. He was already late for a conference call. He should turn back. Instead, he told his driver to follow her. They trailed at a distance as Grace rode to a large laundromat in a rundown strip mall. She locked her bike to a crooked post and disappeared inside. Through the window, Jonathan could see her tying an apron, beginning her shift folding clothes. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, watching her work. She moved with practiced efficiency, folding sheet after sheet, loading washers, helping customers. She smiled at everyone who came in, genuinely smiled, not the fake corporate smile Jonathan was used to seeing and giving. "Sir?" His driver's voice was uncertain. "Do you want to go in?" Jonathan didn't know what he wanted. He only knew that this woman, who had nothing, seemed to possess something he'd lost somewhere along the way to building his fortune: peace, purpose, joy. That evening, Jonathan did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the public library. The librarian, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, helped him access the databases without asking questions about why a man in a $3,000 suit needed to use a public computer. Jonathan searched property records, school registration databases, anything that might give him information about the woman and child he'd seen. It took 2 hours, but he found her. Grace Elena Moreno, age 31, single mother, renting a one-room apartment in the Oak Street complex, one of the older, cheaper buildings the city had been threatening to condemn for years. Employed at Martinez Office Cleaning Services and Sunshine Laundromat, no vehicle registered to her name, no credit cards, no savings account he could find. Her son was Mateo David Moreno, age 7, enrolled at Lincoln Elementary. Perfect attendance for 2 years straight. Jonathan sat back in the uncomfortable library chair, staring at the screen. The basic facts told him so little and so much. This was a woman who worked 2 jobs, who rode a broken bicycle in the rain, who had nothing and who still made sure her son got to school every single day with a smile on his face. He thought about his own childhood. His father had been wealthy, distant, more interested in board meetings than baseball games. Jonathan had everything money could buy and nothing money couldn't. He'd sworn he'd be different, that he'd build something meaningful. But somewhere along the way, he'd become his father. Worse, maybe he didn't even have a child to neglect. He had nothing but money and emptiness. "Can I help you find anything else?" Mrs. Chen appeared beside him, her voice gentle. Jonathan looked up at her kind face and found himself asking the question that had been haunting him. "How do you know if you're doing the right thing with your life?" Mrs. Chen smiled. "I think, young man, you know the answer when you meet someone who is." That night, Jonathan made a decision. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't just walk away from this. Grace Moreno had unknowingly shown him what he'd lost. Now he had to figure out how to help her without destroying the dignity that made her who she was. It happened on a Wednesday evening. Grace had just picked up Mateo from the after-school program, a free service the school offered that gave her an extra hour to finish her laundromat shift. She'd used her tip money from that week to buy a small bag of groceries, rice, beans, eggs, a carton of milk, and because Mateo had been so good lately, a small chocolate bar as a surprise. The bag hung from her handlebar as they rode through the evening streets. Mateo was telling her about his day, about how he'd gotten a gold star on his math test, about how his teacher said he could be anything he wanted when he grew up. "What do you want to be, mi amor?" Grace asked, pedaling steadily. "I want to be like you, Mama," Mateo said simply. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "You can be more than me, baby. You can be anything." They were crossing an intersection. Grace had the light. She was certain of it, when the car came from nowhere. Later, witnesses would say the driver had been texting, had run the red light, hadn't even seen the bicycle until it was too late. The car clipped the back wheel, sending the bike spinning. Grace felt herself flying, felt time slow down to a horrible crawl. Her only thought was Mateo. She twisted in the air, trying to position herself between her son and the pavement. She felt the impact, heard her own bone crack, felt pain explode to her left arm and ribs. The groceries scattered across the street, milk cartons splitting open, eggs breaking, the chocolate bar sliding into a storm drain. Then everything went black. When Grace opened her eyes, she was on the ground. Faces swirled above her, strangers, concerned, asking questions she couldn't quite hear. Pain radiated through her body like lightning. "Mateo," she whispered. "Where's my son?" "He's okay, ma'am. He's right here. Try not to move." Grace turned her head and saw him. Mateo sat on the curb, crying but unhurt. The bike seat had protected him, and Grace's body had taken the worst of the fall. Thank God. Thank God. The ambulance arrived. Paramedics stabilized Grace's arm broken, they said, along with at least 2 ribs. They wanted to take her to the hospital, but Grace shook her head violently. I can't afford. I don't have insurance, please. I just need... Ma'am, you need medical attention. My son. I need to take care of my son. One of the paramedics, a young woman with kind eyes, knelt beside her. We'll make sure he's taken care of. Right now, you need to take care of yourself. Grace wanted to argue, but the pain was overwhelming. She reached for Mateo's hand. It's okay, mi amor. Mama's okay. But Mateo's face told a different story. He'd seen his mother hurt, seen her helpless, and his young mind was trying to process something no 7-year-old should have to face. At the hospital, they set Grace's arm in a cast and wrapped her ribs. The doctor, an older man with gray hair, spoke to her gently. You're going to need to rest for at least 6 weeks. No physical labor. No, I can't rest for 6 weeks, Grace said. I have 2 jobs. I have rent. I have a son. The doctor's face softened with sympathy. I understand. But if you don't let yourself heal, you don't understand, Grace interrupted, her voice breaking. If I don't work, we don't eat. We don't have a home. There is no rest. The social worker arrived then, a well-meaning woman who talked about programs and assistance in temporary housing. Grace listened, nodded, signed papers, but inside she was calculating. The bike was destroyed. Both jobs required physical labor. She couldn't do with a broken arm. The rent was due in 12 days. They were going to lose everything. That night, Grace and Mateo took a taxi home. The driver, seeing her cast, didn't charge them full price. In their small apartment, Grace sat on the edge of the pull-out couch and finally let herself cry. Mateo climbed into her lap, careful of her injuries. Don't cry, Mama. We'll be okay. Grace held him with her good arm and prayed for the first time in days. Not for money, not for a miracle, just for strength to face whatever came next. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping against the window like a question with no answer. And 3 miles away, in his downtown penthouse, Jonathan Pierce sat at his desk, looking at the business card in his hand. He'd been trying to work up the courage to approach Grace Moreno for a week now, trying to figure out the right way to help without offending her pride. He didn't know he was already too late. Jonathan found out about the accident the next day. He'd driven past the laundromat on his way to a business meeting and noticed Grace wasn't there. The manager, a heavy-set man named Rodriguez, was behind the counter instead of Grace. Jonathan pulled over and went inside. Excuse me, I'm looking for the woman who usually works here, Grace? Rodriguez looked up, surprised to see a man in an expensive suit in his establishment. Grace? She had an accident, got hit by a car. Broke her arm pretty bad. Jonathan felt his stomach drop. Is she okay? Her son? Kid's fine. Grace is tough, she'll recover, but she can't work for a while. Rodriguez shook his head. Shame. She was the best worker I had. Never late, never complained, but I can't hold the position. I need someone who can do the physical work. You're firing her? Rodriguez bristled. I'm not firing her. I'm being realistic. She can't fold clothes with a broken arm, can she? I told her she could come back when she's healed, but... He trailed off, and Jonathan understood the unspoken truth. By the time Grace healed, someone else would have the job. Jonathan left the laundromat and sat in his car, hands shaking. This was his fault. If he'd approached her sooner, if he'd offered help before the accident. No, this wasn't about him. This was about a woman who'd already been struggling and now faced losing everything. He made a decision. 20 minutes later, Jonathan stood outside Grace's apartment, holding a folder full of papers he'd hastily prepared. His heart was pounding. He'd negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but this terrified him, because this mattered in a way business never had. He knocked. The door opened, and there she was, Grace Moreno, one arm in a cast, moving stiffly from what Jonathan now knew were broken ribs. Her face showed surprise, then wariness when she saw his expensive suit. Can I help you? Her voice was polite but guarded. Ms. Moreno, my name is Jonathan Pierce. He paused, realizing how insane this was about to sound. I saw your accident the other day. I wanted to make sure you were okay. Grace's expression shifted to confusion. You saw it? I was passing by, Jonathan lied. He couldn't tell her he'd been following her, trying to work up courage. I saw what happened. I'm so sorry. That's kind of you, but we're fine. She began to close the door. Wait, please. Jonathan held up the folder. I'm a businessman. I own several properties in the city, and I have a proposition that might help you. Grace's eyes narrowed. I'm not interested in charity, Mr. Pierce. It's not charity. It's a job offer. Behind Grace, Jonathan could see Mateo sitting at a small table doing homework. The boy looked up, his dark eyes curious and cautious. Grace glanced back at her son, then stepped into the hallway, partially closing the door behind her. What kind of job? Jonathan took a breath. He prepared this speech, rehearsed it, but now all the words seemed wrong. I own a property management company. I need someone to oversee tenant relations, handle concerns, coordinate maintenance. It's administrative work, nothing physical. You could do it with your injury. Why me? Grace asked bluntly. You don't know me. I asked around. People say you're reliable, honest, hard-working. That's what I need. It was partially true. Jonathan had made calls, had confirmed what he'd already suspected. Grace Moreno was exactly the kind of person he'd stopped being. Grace studied him for a long moment. What's the salary? Jonathan named a figure enough to cover rent, food, medical bills, with some left over. He'd calculated it carefully, enough to help without being so generous it seemed fake. Grace's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed again. That's too much for administrative work. It's the going rate for someone with your skills. I don't have administrative skills. I clean offices and fold laundry. You manage 2 jobs, a child, a household on almost no money, and from what I've heard, you never miss a commitment. Those are exactly the skills I need. Grace looked down at her cast, then back at Jonathan. Why are you really doing this? The question caught Jonathan off guard with its directness. He could have lied, could have given her some corporate answer. Instead, he told her the truth, because 3 weeks ago I was stuck in traffic, late for a meeting that I thought was the most important thing in the world. I saw you riding your bike in the rain with your son, and I realized I'd forgotten what actually matters. You reminded me. Grace's expression softened slightly, but suspicion remained. I don't need pity. It's not pity, it's respect. Jonathan held out the folder. Just look at the offer. Think about it. You don't have to decide now. Grace took the folder with her good hand, still studying him. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. As Jonathan walked back to his car, he heard the apartment door close. He didn't know if Grace would take the job. He didn't know if he'd even offered it the right way. But for the first time in years, he felt like he'd done something that actually mattered. Inside the apartment, Grace sat down at the table next to Mateo, staring at the folder. Her son looked up from his homework. Who was that, Mama? I don't know, my amor, Grace said softly, but I think maybe he's an angel. Angels don't wear suits, Mateo said seriously. Grace smiled despite everything. Maybe some of them do. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat at her small table after Mateo had gone to bed, reading through Jonathan Pierce's offer by the light of her single lamp. The contract was straightforward, almost suspiciously so. Administrative assistant for Pierce Properties. Reasonable hours. Health insurance included. Salary that would change their lives. It was too good to be true. Grace had learned the hard way that things that seemed too good were usually hiding something. Mateo's father had seemed too good, charming, promising, full of dreams. Then he disappeared the moment Grace told him she was pregnant, leaving her with nothing but memories and a growing life inside her. She trusted the landlord at their last apartment, who'd seemed kind, until he tried to raise the rent illegally, forcing them out when Grace couldn't pay. She trusted her first employer, who'd promised steady hours, and then cut them without notice. Trust had cost Grace everything more than once, but as she read the contract again, she couldn't find the trap. And more than that, she remembered Jonathan Pierce's eyes when he'd stood in her hallway. There had been something genuine there, not pity, but something deeper. Understanding maybe, or loneliness that recognized itself. At 3 in the morning, Grace got up and looked in on Mateo. He slept peacefully, one arm thrown over his head, his face relaxed in dreams. She thought about all the nights she'd lain awake worrying about him. Whether he'd have enough to eat, whether they'd lose the apartment, whether her 2 jobs would be enough. She thought about the accident, about how close she'd come to leaving him alone in the world. And she thought about the chocolate bar that had fallen into the storm drain, that small treat she'd wanted to give him, that she'd saved tip money to buy, that had been destroyed in an instant. Mateo deserved more than broken bicycles and torn plastic tarps. He deserved a chance. Grace made her decision. The next morning, she called the number on Jonathan Pierce's business card. His assistant answered, professional and polite, and put Grace through immediately. Ms. Moreno. Jonathan's voice was warm, eager. Have you considered my offer? I have, Grace said, and I'll accept on one condition. Name it. I want to earn this. I'll work as hard for you as I've worked anywhere else. I don't want special treatment because of my situation. If I'm not good at the job, you fire me. Deal? There was a pause. Then Jonathan laughed, a genuine sound of relief and joy. Deal. When can you start? My doctor says I can do light work. Is Monday too soon? Monday is perfect. Grace hung up the phone and sat very still, letting the reality sink in. Then she went to wake Mateo for school, and for the first time in 3 years she didn't dread the day ahead. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and cool air. Grace dressed in the only professional outfit she owned, a simple navy dress she'd bought at a thrift store years ago, carefully mended and pressed. Mateo wore his best school clothes, excited because Mama had explained he'd be going to a new after-school program, one at the community center just 2 blocks from her new office. They took the bus, Grace's first time riding with money that didn't have to be saved and counted and rationed. Mateo pressed his face to the window, watching the city slide by. Mama, are you scared? He asked. Grace squeezed his hand. A little, but being scared doesn't mean you stop trying. That's brave, Mateo said seriously. You're brave too, mi amor. Pierce Properties occupied the 3rd floor of a modern building downtown. When Grace walked into the lobby with Mateo, she saw Jonathan waiting. He wore a suit, but he'd loosened his tie and his smile was genuine. Ms. Moreno, welcome. He knelt down to Mateo's level. And you must be Mateo. Your mom has told me you're a very smart young man. Mateo looked at his mother, who nodded encouragement. Thank you, sir. I've arranged for a car service to take you to your after-school program, Jonathan said, standing. The driver's name is Marcus, and he's very nice. Is that okay? Mateo's eyes went wide. Grace started to protest, but Jonathan held up a hand. It's included in the employee benefits. Several of my staff use the service. It was a lie. Jonathan had arranged it specifically for Mateo, but it was the kind of lie that preserved dignity, and Grace recognized it for the gift it was. She nodded. Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Jonathan, please. Over the next weeks, Grace threw herself into her new job with the same determination she'd brought to every challenge in her life. Jonathan had been right, she was perfect for it. Her experience managing impossible schedules, dealing with difficult people, solving problems with limited resources, all of it translated perfectly to tenant relations. She listened to complaints about broken heaters and leaky faucets with the same patience she'd brought to Mateo's homework struggles. She coordinated repairs with the efficiency she'd developed juggling 2 jobs. She treated every tenant with the dignity she'd always wished for herself. Jonathan watched her transform his business. Properties that had high turnover rates stabilized. Tenants who'd been chronically unhappy became advocates. Grace had a gift for making people feel heard, valued, respected. But more than that, she transformed Jonathan. He started spending more time at the office, not less, not to watch over Grace's shoulder, but because the office felt different now. There was laughter. There were conversations about things other than profit margins. Grace brought Mateo by sometimes after school, and the boy would do homework in the break room, occasionally asking Jonathan questions about business that showed remarkable insight. One evening, 3 months after Grace had started, Jonathan found her still at her desk at 7 o'clock. Grace, go home. You're not on the clock anymore. She looked up, smiling. Just finishing the monthly report. It'll be on your desk in the morning. Jonathan sat down across from her. Can I ask you something? Of Course, why aren't you angry? After everything you've been through, the struggle, the accident, all of it, how do you stay so positive? Grace was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. I learned something when Mateo was born. His father had just left. I had no money, no family nearby, no plan. I was terrified. And one night, I was sitting in a hospital room, holding this tiny baby, and I realized something. She looked directly at Jonathan. Being angry wouldn't feed him. Being bitter wouldn't keep him safe. The only thing I could control was how I faced each day with grace or with bitterness. I chose grace, not because I'm special, but because it was the only choice that made sense. Jonathan felt something break open in his chest. I've spent 20 years angry. At my father for being distant, at myself for becoming him, at a world that I thought owed me something. And has it helped? Grace asked gently. No, Jonathan admitted. It's made me rich and miserable. Grace reached across the desk and touched his hand, a gesture of simple human kindness. It's not too late to choose differently. That conversation changed Jonathan's life as profoundly as the job had changed Grace's. He started volunteering at the community center where Mateo attended after-school programs. He began having meals with his employees instead of working through lunch. He reconnected with his mother, whom he'd barely spoken to in 5 years, and he started funding a scholarship program for single parents trying to improve their lives, doing it quietly, without press releases or tax write-offs, just because it was right. 6 months after Grace started working for him, Jonathan made her a partner in the business. Not out of charity, but because she'd earned it. Her insights, her values, her approach to treating people with dignity had made Pierce Properties more successful than it had ever been. Grace cried when he told her. Then she hugged him, the first time she'd hugged anyone other than Mateo in years, and thanked him for seeing her worth. You showed me mine first, Jonathan said. On a sunny Saturday morning, 1 year after their first meeting, Grace and Mateo moved into a new apartment, one of Jonathan's properties, but one she paid fair rent for with her partner's salary. It had 2 bedrooms, a working stove, windows that looked out onto a small park. Mateo ran to the rooms, laughing with delight. Mama! Mama! I have my own room. Grace stood in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face, and thought about the journey that had brought them here. The struggle, the pain, the broken bicycle. The accident, all of it had led to this moment. Jonathan arrived with a housewarming gift, a framed photo of Grace and Mateo on her first day of work, both of them smiling at the camera. To remember where you came from, he said. I'll never forget, Grace promised. But more importantly, I'll never forget the man who saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You were never invisible, Jonathan said softly. I was just blind. That evening, after Jonathan had left and Mateo had fallen asleep in his new room, Grace sat by the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there, she knew, other women were riding broken bicycles through the rain, working 2 jobs, struggling to keep their children fed and safe. She couldn't save them all, but she could help some. And she would, because she learned that Grace wasn't just her name. It was a choice you made every day to keep going, to keep hoping, to keep believing that kindness and dignity mattered, even when the world suggested otherwise. And in the end, that choice had saved 2 lives, hers and the life of a millionaire CEO who'd had everything except what mattered most. This story teaches us several profound truths. First, that dignity is not defined by circumstance, but by character. Grace Moreno had nothing by material standards, yet she possessed something far more valuable, the ability to face each day with grace, determination, and love. She showed her son that worth isn't measured in dollars, but in how we treat others and ourselves. Second, that we are all one moment away from seeing what truly matters. Jonathan Pierce had built an empire but lost himself in the process. It took a single glimpse of a woman on a bicycle, struggling yet persevering, to wake him up to what he'd been missing. Sometimes the greatest success is simply paying attention. Third, that help given with respect is always more powerful than charity given with pity. Jonathan didn't rescue Grace. He offered her an opportunity to use her existing strengths. He recognized her value rather than her victimhood. This preserved her dignity while changing her circumstances. Fourth, that our struggles prepare us for our purpose. Every hardship Grace faced, the 2 jobs, the broken bicycle, The accident developed in her the exact skills and compassion she needed to excel in her new role and to help transform Jonathan's business and life. Finally, that kindness is never one-directional. Grace saved Jonathan as much as he helped her. True generosity creates a circle, not a line. When we give with respect and receive with grace, both parties are lifted up. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that their struggles have purpose, that dignity cannot be bought or sold, and that kindness, real, respectful kindness, can change everything. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that remind us what it means to be human in a world that sometimes forgets. And remember, you might be one small act of kindness away from changing someone's life, or they might be one moment away from changing yours. The question is, will you be paying attention?